Okay. So just a brief introduction for our participants that are here with us today. Mat Fournier is a trans studies scholar with an interest in literature, critical theory, and science studies. His research focuses on the intersection of power and gender. More importantly, he is a queer French trans man living on a small farm in the Finger Lakes region. A hiker, gardener, cross-country skier, lover of trees, books, trails, rocks, and springs. Currently an associate professor of French at Ithaca College since 2014. Fournier previously pursued a career as a freelance journalist specializing in ethnobiology. Before we get into our discussion here, just so our participants know, you can put questions in the little question box on the side as well as in the chat. If you have questions throughout the discussion, we will get to those towards the end in our Q&A. Okay. So to kind of just start us off, I want to come back to that one of the last parts there in your little short bio. So before you entered the field of academia, you worked as a journalist and that freelance author. So what did the shift into this field look like for you? What led you to be where you're at now with your work?
So yeah, first of all, Andrew, hi, and thank you so much for doing this with me. I'm very honored to be there. And yeah, I used to work as a freelance writer and journalist in France, and of course, my plan was to become a writer, but as we know, it's not a very easy field when you want to make any money. And at some point, it was becoming very difficult to make a living as a freelance journalist because of development in the profession. And also, it was not easy to live in France as queer. So I decided to with some help, I decided to trust myself and go back to school and start a PhD program in France. And I was lucky enough to get a full scholarship for 3 years. And with that, I became an exchange student in the US. And the reason why I moved to the US, it may seem strange now with what's happening this day, but it was much easier to find a job and to have interesting prospects and stimulating intellectual prospects in academia on the one hand, and also much easier to live as queer and to transition. So that's also in the US when I started transitioning from female to male, or when I started hormone replacement therapy. And so what it has been like moving into American academia was the possibility to completely discover queer theory, queer studies, trans studies, which were, I mean, somewhat visible in France, but from very far away. So, for instance, most queer theory books haven't been translated into French until 2006, 2010. So I fell in love with queer theory and trans studies, and like I said, I also started transitioning. So it was a big shift in my life, and things were coming together.
Okay. I think one thing with your story getting into this is I can definitely resonate with like getting into queer and trans studies, being from the American South, where it's very difficult to have these conversations due to culture and general political climates. It's not often discussed socially, and there's I came from a program that didn't have a strong like grounding in queer theory, so it's I always love hearing these different journeys that we've gone through to get kind of where we are and to engage with these theories. So how did this lead you to writing the novel that you are a finalist here for today, Dysphoric Modernism, Undoing Gender in French Literature?
So when I started, at first I just read a lot of queer theory, and then I had the idea to merge the two things that two things I knew better, which was to merge queer theory and trans studies with my French background in literary studies. So meaning this modernist French canon that I looked at in the book, and because this these writers that I discuss in the book, like the French canon, Proust, Gide, Genet, they are well known, but they were known as gay mostly, or people who disrupt norms by through looking at sexuality, but by reading them through a queer through a trans lens. I also expose how gender plays a part in the process. And what was also interesting to me through them was looking into the history of exchange, cultural exchanges between France and the US, because there's a lot of coming and going. So, for instance, we know that queer theory has been influenced by what is called continental philosophy, so particularly the works of Foucault, which itself has been influenced by those writers of the canon I just mentioned. But there's also, so there's a whole circulation of knowledge, but there's also um, sometimes misunderstanding, fascinations, and also creative misunderstanding. So going from one context to the next, things change and switch, and so that's also what I look at in the book. And it was also particularly interesting for me because it was merging with my own history and things that I was familiar with in the past that I was discovering in a completely new light.
Okay, that's really interesting. In the introduction of your novel, you do this beautiful job of building your critical approach by dissecting and ultimately, creating this genealogy between these key terms that you focus on: the assemblage, gender, dysphoria, and trans, as being these interconnected concepts that then lead into your application in your analysis through these different works of literature. Could you take a moment to kind of explain how you connect these fields or these concepts together, or how you came to them through the lens of French modernism?
Okay, so yeah, one of the things that also interests me a lot is the philosophical work of Deleuze and Guattari. And so they have a whole range of concepts that are very useful to talk about gender and sexuality and identities too. And so I came to the concept of assemblage, which I used to describe gender and particularly the modern gender binary in which we are still living, because it allows for a more organic conception of gender and the way it works than, for instance, the idea of social construct. The idea of social construct is useful, but might be misleading because it seems to imply that somebody has been actively constructing something and that it can be deconstructed, whereas the truth is much more complex. And so an assemblage, for instance, can be one good example to look at what an assemblage is, for instance, borders, like how it works. It's, there's geography, but it's also infrastructure. There are bodies, people, there's ideology, there's words, coding, language, but also it's a life and death matter. And it's also shifting and arbitrary, but yet very real. And that's what the assemblage does. It allows us to look at all those components together. And so what's also is very interesting and important for me is to account for bodies and individual life and not just, words and concepts when we talk about gender and social constructs. So I think, so I described the gender binary as an assemblage, something that is stable but yet unstable and capable of shifting, and something that's fluid but also artificially fixated. And what's interesting with any assemblage is that they both work, like, borders, sadly, they work. Gender, it works, it's there. But it also doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work for us individually. It doesn't work for affect. It doesn't work for when we want our agency, when we want to just, live in the world. So I think, yeah, assemblage was great to discuss gender. And then when looking at gender as an assemblage, I found that gender is always dysphoric. So there's no gender without dysphoria, or there's no border without claustrophobia, if you will. So I describe dysphoria as a continuum, something that can be intense when, well, those of us have, those of us can, those of us who have experienced dysphoria know that it's, deeply personal, very acute, intense. And on the other hand of the spectrum, it's something that people feel without even thinking about it when they ask themselves every day, am I a real man? Am I decent woman? Do I look right? Do I look the part? Do I look like that kind of man, that kind of woman? So that's how it all came together.
Okay, I'm seeing one of the things we look at when looking about modernism is this kind of larger approach to like the shift in thought here, and it sometimes can feel like there is no individual voice at times due to all like these kind of like shifting ideas and thoughts that are kind of happening at this turn of the century, going into World War One. So I like that in your work you focus on this individualized personal voice and the lived experiences. Do you think that, or rather how or why, I guess, is modernism, or specifically French modernism, an ideal vessel to explore this framework of individual lived experiences?
So I think modernism is very interesting. First, there's this whole experimental experience with voices in writing and in creative new forms. So of course that's a very important opportunity to explore how gender and sexuality are shaped into personal experiences. But on the other hand, it also looks at the collective, because writing is, I mean, public writing like literature is also giving accounts of something that is both personal and collective. And modernism is a time period where gender, or the binary as we know it and as we still live in it, has emerged with at first no clear lines between what we would call now gender identity or sexual orientation. That doesn't mean that people didn't know what they were doing and who they were in love with or attracted to and who they wanted to be, but just there were much more circulation between the one and the other. And also, it's the time when the emergence of sexology marked all these discussions about gender and sexuality. Sometimes it wasn't an easy process, right? Sexology is not always our friends, and has been more prescriptive than descriptive. So there were, in literature at the time, there were a lot of sometimes masked but very real discussion and pushback against sexology as the pathologization of queer people. So that's also why it's a very interesting period to discuss.
Kind of going off of that, do you see dysphoria operating differently in the literature of this time as opposed to the lived experiences of the people?
I think yes and no. Yes, because as I was saying, when dysphoria becomes a personal experience, then it becomes all about you, and it's very intense, and it's something that's is really hard to express sometimes, and also something that is really hard to live with. So it's deeply personal, and so, but literature allows us to look at dysphoria from the collective level. So not only my individual painful dysphoria, but the structural dysphoria that is there always whenever we live in a gendered society. And so looking at literature allows to see how dysphoria is circulating from one individual to the next and from one aspect of lived experience to the other. So in that sense, I would say that the dysphoria expressed in literature is always collective, even when it's recalling one personal experience.
Okay. Um, it's really interesting to kind of think about this approach to a topic that's difficult to discuss when you've not really experienced it. It gives a different kind of
there's this circulation between what is personal and feels very private and very embodied, and and the circulation and what is expressed through, for instance, storytelling, that is a kind of wisdom, even if it sounds cheesy, that tells us about society. So reading about dysphoria is not only validating because, it helps me figure out what's going on with me, but it also, on the more philosophical level, it also shows that my dysphoria is not only my dysphoria, and it's not only mine and yours, it's also the dysphoria that we've been dealt with because we live in such a world, or because we live in a gender world, and a world that is gendered in particular ways.
definitely, and that's a kind of impacts like how we interact both in the community and outside of our communities. Many of the works that are discussed in your book highlight how dysphoria emerges under the guise of, to borrow from your book, under the guise of male same-sex desire. Can you speak to the decision to focus on the male same-sex desire side as opposed to including like lesbian subplots or other subplots there?
So it wasn't at first a decision, and when I was working on the book, started to hear from people giving me feedback that it was too masculine, and I was looking at guy's world, and then I realized that first at some point I tried to cover everything, and so the easy answer to your question is that there was just too much or too many of it. But also in my research, I started to find out that working on those big names, the gay guys from the French canon, I started to see there was a pattern of, yes, they disrupt norms. Yes, they go against the grain. Yes, they criticize strongly the position of masculinity and try to find livable positions from themselves outside of this assignment to rigid masculinity. But on the other hand, they do that in using their privileged positions as white men, and most often rich white men. They use their privileged position to instrumentalize femininity, for instance, and race. So the way they do that is they create this sort of fantasy of femininity as an alternative to everything they hate, like law and order. So it's femininity is discussed as a sort of way to escape normativity. But in doing this, they fetishize it, and and in the end, they are able to assert, for instance, non-normative sexuality and identities, while reinforcing the gender binary, and also while reinforcing the racial binary, because they also use people of color, and they also use colonization and colonized people as ways to explore, again, alternative modes of being, while at the same time orientalizing these people and denying the subjectivity of the people they orientalize and use in the narrative. So this was a discovery that was quite disturbing for me, because I had grown up or studied in college in admiring those people and feeling them inspiring, and now I came to see the limits of why they were of what they were doing, and how disturbing it was. And so I also felt that this work had to be done in this way, because we need to both see what we learn from them and at what cost it came, because we are still living in the same model, I think.
I would agree that we still very much live in a similar, if not the same model, and being able to recognize that yes, these contributions are important, but there are other things at work that were, not being addressed, not being talked about um, when it comes to people of color or people who do not fit that binary of, the white male or the rich white male. Um,
Yeah, and when I was working on it, it was disturbing to see that they were, in a way, a solution, but they were also pretty much part of the problem. And that was disturbing, like I said, when I first came upon it. But then now that I've been working on it, I think it taught me much more about the world and how we can reproduce patterns even without knowing it, just because we live in them. So we have to go with the flow to some extent. Um, and I find looking frontally at these contradictions was very helpful for me.
it does, when kind of looking into this, does feel very helpful to like get to get this perspective. And it kind of calls into the frame this idea of like the genealogies of the queer literary canon and how we have these past writers and voices that we can kind of follow this thread into the present with the language they use, the themes that they present, or kind of just the overall influence. Even though at the time and in the past that they weren't necessarily, well, not even necessarily, they were not, able to be open about their identities in many capacities. And you touch on the idea of genealogies a little bit in your book, which I found interesting because that overlapped with my own work, looking at these threads from past to present. But when thinking about these genealogies of queer and trans literature on a broad scale, do you find that that theme still exists? For instance, you discuss Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness in conjunction with Rostand's novel, whose work is at the center of your analysis there in that first chapter. Is there a thread of influence that extends beyond his contemporaries, beyond Rostand's contemporaries, I mean, like Hall, and kind of into the present that follows that kind of idea of feeling backwards in time?
I I think so. But what's also interesting is that now that enough time has passed so that the influence might not even be visible and certainly not conscious. So there has been a lot of intermediate between, say, the Well of Loneliness and what is being written right now. So, but I think the plots echo one another because we are still revolving about, for instance, the idea of feeling backwards. Um, Means that there's this need to connect to community that we never knew, to communicate through times, like to create this queer genealogy and to put it simply, just to get in touch virtually in reading, get in touch with those queer ancestors in a way. And what happens is that this makes for really good storytelling, the feeling backwards plot, because we need to we as queer writers need to still account for those feelings of nostalgia, anxiety, loss, and in order to do that, we try to connect and reach out to other communities sharing the same feelings. And I think, for instance, a great example of the feeling backward motive in terms of genealogy and exploring this negativity from a queer perspective is the very recent book of Ocean Vuong, Emperor of Gladness. It's completely different in terms of plot from The Well of Loneliness, for instance, and the queer narrator is not talking about queerness in the broader sense, but still there's this whole discussion of uh, how to connect with different community, or how to connect beyond trauma, how to deal with a very contemporary sense of sense of loss, how to deal with the effect of colonization, how to deal with the effect of the gender divide. So I think this modernist feeling backward motive is still very present in queer lit, and it's a good thing.
I think that also kind of speaks to this idea of like why it's important to recover and reread these queer figures in history and literature, even if those identities can't necessarily be mapped or easily mapped onto these contemporary categories. But would you see this recovery as more about justice, representation, or simply kind of like reimagining this literary canon, or these lived experiences, or some kind of combination of these things?
Yeah, I would say, in a sense, all of it. I mean, representation is ambiguous because we don't want to claim sameness. I mean, we want to reach out, like I was saying, but we don't want to claim sameness. On the other hand, it's also important to reclaim this writers, for instance, who have been read as canonical, and to say, yeah, but they were talking about gender, they were talking about sexuality, they were talking about these things that are sometimes not even taught in English classes, not even these days. I always find it's very strange how people hear about many writers or philosophers without simply hearing that they were queer. Um, which may not be the most important thing about them, but then again, it's not something we should ignore. So representation is definitely there, but also it's about finding other ways of being queer, seeing that there were other ways of being queer, and reaching out um, through those different modalities in ways that can be very important for us. It can basically, it's not only about this creating an archive and proving that the archive exists and there were people like us all along. It's also about looking into what they can teach us, how they can help us change, be resilient, overcome our issues, become more open-minded, or become more adjusted to different circumstances.
And that kind of, I think, resonates today with this idea of being able to access our communities, in a regular and safe ways. How do you approach this balance between theory and research and this kind of community accessibility?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question and a very difficult thing to do, because so I would say the first thing is, when you write, you need to be understood. And there's very simply speaking, the need for clarity is very important. And it's almost a question of ethics, right? You don't want to write for the five people who happen to seem to speak the same vernacular academic language as you do. And that's also why I'm so glad to be here and so glad to have been a finalist, because it proves me that I can reach out beyond beyond the small community of specialists. So that's the first thing. But then the more complicated thing is that queer theory, trans studies, they are situated knowledge. So that's theory speaking from one perspective, and there should be a constant coming and going circulation between the actual position and the community and theory itself, meaning that it's not only theory is not only meant to be for the community, in the sense that it's also more importantly from the community. It's speaking from the community to a broader world, to broader issues. So, for instance, what do queerness or transness teach us about the world? Not only about trans people, not only about queer people, not only about gender, not only about sexuality, but for instance, in ways we relate to ourselves. I think transness has a lot to teach about embodiments, for instance, ways we relate to our bodies, ways to relate to community, ways in which we relate to the natural world. So I think there needs to be a constant circulation between, yes, I belong to this community. I'm speaking from this very personal position, and I'm also trying to find the tools to turn it into a knowledge that can be shared beyond the community.
I think that's honestly such an amazing kind of way to approach this and like engage with the community to like to share your experience and to like create these connections. Um, I had another follow-up question on that and I just lost it. That's something that you said. I'll come back to it.
Yeah.
And so you have a new book that's working in progress,
Yes.
right? Transferality Beyond Natures. What kind of sparked this project? Does it come from like an extension of your previous work, and kind of what direction is it taking / do you see it taking?
I think it is a strange follow-up on my previous work in the sense that it is still, I mean, still the main question is the relationship between gender and power, or even gender and capitalism. So how does gender inform our lives, and how is the gender binary used to control us? But I was saying it's strange because now I'm turning more towards science studies. So as in the previous book, in Dysphoric Modernism, the material I was using to um, make my points, and the material I was exploring was written work, so this modernist literature. And now I'm more looking directly at science studies, and particularly what we call nature and the idea of nature and how this relates to transness. So basically, what I'm arguing is that nature is also a recent invention. The concept of nature, not the living world. The living world is there, as we know, but the concept of nature is also an assemblage. It can also be looked as an assemblage, really like gender, and it's a modern invention that is at the origin of binaries, in which we are stuck now. So nature emerged as what is not man. So there's this binary of man versus nature, and then it's complementing the man versus woman binary, and so of course woman is on the side of nature, and then it also sparks the whole series of binaries of whiteness, blackness, of colonized population. And so nature has been used as an argument to and divide and exploit. And so I'm using transness to question that, to question the idea of nature, and to question, for instance, the mind body divide, to question the technology versus biology divide, to question the us humans versus the world divide, and so on. I think I've been rambling a bit, but I mean, my projects are loosely connected, let's say.
Okay. I think that conversation on these binaries is especially important in current climates and seeing how these binaries interact, and not to go too far to the left with Derrida, but like deconstructing these binaries that we are currently working through,
Yes,
or
and
rather
yeah,
waiting for.
yeah. I mean, we are facing a very strong comeback of those very strong binaries with recent politics, and we can see how these two obsession, like the lack of, I mean, the control of nature, that is the exploitation of nature, and the recent killing of any environmental measure of protection, how these work together with the scapegoating of trans people, and the very strong enforcement of the gender binary and heteronormativity. And we can see very clearly that they are very strongly coming together. And what I agree is that it's not random, or it's just not bigotry in general. It's more that the gender binary and the exploitation of nature are part of the same concept. They're also part of the same political agenda, which is exploitation and authority.
And I think you kind of touched on this, here as well, but these parallels between the way that gender and nature have been regulated or largely disciplined in society. But do you see a way that they've been maybe romanticized as well?
Yes, yeah, and I think romanticized is the right word because it's also during the Romantic period that our understanding of nature developed with the idea of the sublime and nature as refuge and nature as wilderness. And for instance, in the US, it's particularly visible with the idea of and the representation, like for instance someone like Bierstadt, the representation of the West as an empty space. So we can see how the romanticization of nature has been part of the American colonial project, because if it's empty then we can have it, we can protect it, and so on. Empty of human, I mean. And in Europe, it was more or less the same thing with the romanticization of landscapes, for instance, in the mountains, with people actually living there, working there, farmers, for instance, being part of this romantic landscape, but not treated as equal, and agriculture just treated as a picturesque thing, which leads us to an impasse, because now all we can do about the living world is, on the one hand, um, conservation, which ignores any human activity and relationship with the land, on the one hand, and on the other hand, just pure exploitation and large scale agro industry, for instance. And so the idea of nature is pretty much was what put us in this situation in the first place.
That's a really interesting kind of thread to follow. Is that like you just said, nature putting us in this position in the first place. And I think it's one that creators, writers have been grappling with since the Romantics, and even before that, kind of how we interact with nature. And I think we're at a time now where we're getting more, oh, more voices that are engaging with this, natural ecology of the land and the body. Kind of pivot a little bit from there. One of the questions, or we'll say feedback pieces, I get in some academic circles is, there's always a focus on the origins of queer theory, the hard like beginnings with Sedgwick and Foucault, Butler, and we kind of become faced with this like this idea of, well, what is the literature trying to say now? How does theory now reflect these new trends? And what is actually happening in the theory now? Um,
I think, well, some of the things that are very interesting. Maybe I'm biased because that's my also main interest. But some of the things that are in the field of trans ecology, for instance, trans ecology, ecofeminism, trans in queer ecologies. I mean, a lot of things are happening because, and I think what's interesting, queer theory has always been interdisciplinary. And at the beginning, it was more geared toward literature, with the example of Sedgwick. Then trans studies have came and put some trouble into it, saying, okay, what about us? And also, what about bodies? What about embodiments? And for years, there was this divide between queer theory and trans studies. And I think now we are merging again in a good way, because we are all looking for ways to account for bodies and embodiments, and not only words and performativity, but also how to live in the world. And as we are looking into bodies and forms of embodiment, we are also looking out towards the, let's say, the natural world, not use the word nature, towards other living creature, and how towards ecosystem and towards and so we are merging the question of trans embodiments with, for instance, questions of environmental issues and questions of and we are also integrating all the scientific knowledge of and ways of thinking about ecosystem, for instance, resilience of ecosystem, which I find very interesting theoretically.
And yeah, I think there's a lot of parallel between the resilience of ecosystem and the resilience of community at different levels. What advice would you give to scholars who want to write about queer and trans subjects with rigor, but also with care, whether it be, you know, they're new to the field or they're kind of really just starting to dig into their scholarly research, or they are established in their careers and want to start kind of exploring these connections outside of the lens that they're accustomed to?
I think, I mean, the first advice I would give them would be to not to mind gatekeeping. I mean, of course, they'll face not to listen to the gatekeepers, not to listen to people saying it's impossible, or okay, you want to do a PhD, start with something else, or do a PhD that can be professionally applied, or you want to make a living by writing books, or only 5 people are going to read this book. I think it's important to know that you'll face some or a lot of gatekeeping, both as an academic or someone as an academic, as a writer, as a queer person, as someone who works on queerness. There'll be a lot of gatekeeping. Be aware of it. You'll have to jump through hoops and through fire, but do not let it stop you. So that would be my first advice. And then you said you mentioned writing, you know, with care and also with clarity. And I think it's important to know that it's collective work. It's important to know that if all goes well, you'll be giving feedback. And it's even better if you can seek this feedback as much as you can and learn from it. Myself, it took me a very long time to learn that, because every time I wanted to show something, or I was in a situation to show something for publication, for instance, I wanted it to be perfect, which then made me exhausted once I was done, which meant that I wasn't in a great position to accept feedback on the one hand, and on the other hand, I lost time in being so much a perfectionist, whereas the perfectionism could come from the other interlocutors, the feedback. So yeah, that's my two advice. Don't listen to gatekeeper, but listen to feedback.
I think that's honestly such sound advice, because there's so much, you know, gatekeeping in academia already at times, not to mention the paywalls that definitely exist as a form of gatekeeping. And we're coming down to our last couple of minutes. I just wanted to thank you again for talking with me today and being able to share your experience through your work and your personal narratives. And I really wish my camera browser was working so we could see each other on both ends. Still not sure what's happening with that, but
No, yeah, and thank you so much. I mean, this was a great conversation, and I really appreciated your question. I'm also, well, again, grateful for the opportunity to be here, and grateful to the organizer as well, and to those people who have been working so hard to make this happen. Thank you.
yes, we have quite literally 1 minute left, but if anyone in the audience has a question or comment, we can definitely squeeze that in.
Okay, I mean, thank you everyone for sticking with us on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, and thank you for listening and being there.